So hey, thank you so much for joining the call. Thank you so much, Tom, for actually accepting to take this session. We do these bi-weekly. A couple of people will continue joining the call, but hey, so here we usually take different B2B SaaS marketing. We bring in different B2B SaaS marketing professionals, and we just ask them what they're best at, right? And yeah, today we have Tom, who's going to be helping us or telling us about how to start and grow a profitable B2B, a profitable podcast, essentially, right? And I know what I know about Tom. Tom uh, runs two companies, not one. He has an agency that helps companies do this for them, and he also runs Fame.fm, right, which is another service which is also in the podcast space. I think Tom will be better to explain exactly what that does. But yeah, if you just go visit his website, right, he's worked with some really, really, really good companies. So that's why he's here today, and he's going to just help us maybe just walk through, uh, yeah, it's podcasting in general. So over to you, Tom. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, you're totally right. So I think I want to focus on the concept of a profitable podcast. And I'm going to cover like a bit of business stuff, a bit of marketing stuff. Is that okay? Shall I just rant about it? I'll just rant about it for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
So when we say a profitable podcast, what we're essentially meaning is that all of the time and cash we put into this thing, we want to get back and more, right? So then the question is how do you get stuff back from a podcast? There are two ways, or we can break it down into two halves. The first half is from the listener side. Do we get listeners that come to us and buy our stuff? Second is, can we also generate an ROI from the guest side, e.g. the people that we create the content with? Could they be customers or could they be partners? So what I found, and actually probably best to tell my story now, is that I spent like 8 years in online marketing, but then I took like a holiday away from entrepreneurship, and I was head of marketing at a B2B SaaS company. We started a podcast. Long story short is the podcast went really well, or was really profitable in the short term, not because we built an audience. We did, but the audience was quite small, but because actually randomly, one of the guests was the VP. The podcast was about sales operations, by the way, and the company sold sales software. But one of the guests was the VP of sales operations at a software company that everyone here would know. He basically came on the show, did a great interview with me, but randomly got chatting with the CEO afterwards, and 4 months later bought all of our sales software for the whole of their sales team. So that was like a 9 to 10x return on everything we spent on the show after about 6 months. And so I was like, this has to be the holy grail of B2B marketing, because we can see a clear short-term ROI, but we're getting the long-term brand building benefits, SEO, social engagement, etc. Right. So going back to our question of how you make a podcast profitable, the point I'm really trying to make here is that in the short term, unless you have a load of money to spend on ads, you're probably not going to get an ROI from the listener side. So when I say short term, I mean about 6 months. And so what we therefore have to do, because it's very hard to convince a business to invest in something for 6 to 12 months if they can't see a clear ROI, especially nowadays. So what we do to try and maximize the chance the podcast is profitable in the short term, because if it's profitable in the short term, the business or your CFO is never going to say, why are we spending this money on the podcast, right? If you think about that example with the company that I used to be head of marketing at, they're never canceling the podcast. That deal was like significant enough for them. And so like that podcast is still running. They're still a client of Fame. I was the host for 200 episodes. So what I'm saying is that we need to be strategic about the guests we're bringing on the show for the first 6 months, so that we can build relationships that could lead to a profitable outcome in the future. Now, you can't just pitch every guest that you bring on the show, because then the guest is actually going to have a bad feeling towards your company. All you can do is just ensure the guest experience is amazing, and then just build the relationship with that person over time. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a potential customer, although that does work. it can also be a potential partner. So somebody who has an audience of the people that you sell to, if they just have a beautiful experience coming on your podcast, getting to know you, learning about your company, learning about you as a person, then it's going to be so much easier in 3 months if you go to them and be like, hey, can we promote your product? Can we be an affiliate of you? Also, it'd be great if you'd be happy to promote us. And so 6 months, let's say it's a bi-weekly show. That means we are going to be probably about 13 to 14 relationships we're going to build with guests over that time. Let's say 5 of them are potential customers, 5 of them are potential partners. We typically see that maybe a couple customers might go into the sales process. Maybe 1 could buy, but then also we might have like 3 partners from that after 6 months. So if you do that, you take that to the CFO after 6 months. No one is going to tell you to stop this thing if there's a reliable building of relationships between whoever the host is and those people. Then we get the real beauty, like the glory which everyone is trying to achieve, which is an audience, people on the listener side, which are telling their friends about your business, which are like signing up to all your stuff because you're helping them so much, which are ultimately coming through and buying your like software or service. That only happens typically after 6 months if you execute really well, like throughout those 6 months. So when I say profitable podcast, short term, we're looking to build relationships with guests. Long term, we want to generate ROI from the listener side. But the beauty is, if we start building an audience, then it's clear to potential guests that it's actually valuable to come on this show. And then they're more likely to come on the show. Then you get better guests. Then you get a bigger audience. Then you get better guests. And you get this kind of upward flywheel, which is like the holy grail for a B2B show. So that's what I mean by profitable podcast. And that is how I see B2B brands getting there.
I love this. And I think this is unique to B2B though, right? Because if you were a B2C company, you could not leverage the listener side as well. Maybe for partnerships somehow, but definitely not for customers. Right. So
yeah, we
so
haven't. Sorry.
No, yeah, definitely, please. Yeah.
We haven't seen it work that well on the B2C side, but you're right. If you were to take this approach, you would attempt to bring on guests that have an audience of the people that you sell to, like journalists, for example. We've had clients that use that, but we've actually stopped working with any B2C clients because we just want to focus in on the B2B process. It's much more effective for B2B.
Yeah. So, Tom, how do you go about building it? Because I have heard like a friend of mine, right? He started an agency, uh, probably a competitor as well, but a great friend. He started an agency. Within 2 months, he was able to scale to 2 million or about £1 million ARR from zero. And all his only marketing channel or channels were one, relationships, which everyone has, and the second one is a podcast. And that's all he did. And that was it. And he was able to scale his agency from zero to £1 or £2 million, I don't remember anymore, in a year, which is amazing, using exactly what you just mentioned. So yeah, like, how do you scale it? What are the nitty-gritties, or what do you think people should, people would miss? Because if you tell me that, hey, start a podcast, I have a couple of steps in mind, but I'm sure I'll miss out on a few key things, maybe. Yeah.
Cool. So the process for starting and growing a podcast. That's what we're asking, right?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, there's obviously a lot that goes into that. I think I'll pick out a couple of points. The first one, and the most important, is the positioning of the show. And the number one rule here is that it's always easier to start more niche and then go less niche over time. And so the example I like to give is, let's say you had a piece of software or an agency that helped people send better emails for B2B companies. There's really like three possible options for the positioning of your podcast. Could be at least a niche, a marketing show. Then the next one would be an email marketing show. And then the next one, more niche again, would be the like open rate podcast, the email open rate podcast. So the recommendation here would be to start the open rate podcast, not the marketing podcast, not the email marketing podcast. The reason being is that it's going to be easier to find guests when you're more specific, because when you reach out to the 100 people in the world that are best at increasing open rates, they're going to be like, yes, I love talking about that. And then it's also going to be easier for you to become the number one most downloaded email open rate podcast in the world. And then from there, once you have an audience of people that are really interested in increasing email open rates, then you would potentially move and branch out and then become the email marketing show. And then you might spend like 3 to 4 years becoming, maybe less than that, maybe like 1 to 2 years becoming the most downloaded show in email marketing. I think that would be achievable. And then once you've done that, then maybe you would branch out into like marketing or maybe like e-commerce, depending on what your focus is. So what I typically see is B2B brands not going niche enough with their podcast topic. And so that's the first thing that I think most people get wrong. Second thing is, we've already covered this.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question here, right? So sorry to cut you off, but how important is it to be unique? For example, right, if you're starting something in B2, for example, because that's the example I'm thinking about, right? So if we sell performance marketing services or SEO services, right? Now we could have the B2B SaaS performance marketing, and you're saying that's not niche enough. We should probably go very deep in something. Is that the only way to be? I'm assuming because that's like a unique angle as well, apart from easy to find guests. But is there some other way apart from niching which we could use to, just find a unique angle? Or I'll give you an example, right? For example, what if you started interviewing buyers instead of marketers, right? B2B SaaS buyers, it's still unique enough, but it's very broad. Do you think that could work?
Okay, so let's go back to your example. You were saying performance marketing for B2B.
Yeah.
I think the B2B performance marketing show would probably be niche enough, because you would only focus on guests from B2B and cover performance marketing. I would potentially niche down further to be like the B2B Google Ads show. First, that would probably be my recommendation. Your second point about only, I think the like one strategy to create something different is to find a niche that nobody is in or that few people are in. There are other strategies you can take in like the structure of the podcast or the structure of the episodes that can make you different as well, stand out from competitors. Like your example of, instead of interviewing the experts of B2B performance marketing, you would interview the buyers of B2B performance marketing. Now, there could be a problem with this though. Is that what is the incentive for a B2B buyer to come on the show? Typically, like the incentive for a B2B performance marketer to come on the show is like self-explanatory. They get to come and talk about the thing that they spend all their time doing. They can use this like episode to put on their LinkedIn profile to show a new potential employer like how great they are. And also, if they're an expert, they may work for like a B2B performance marketing agency, and therefore people listening could be potential customers. I don't know if there would be a big incentive for the buyer to come on the show. So that's something you have to consider as well when you're picking the strategy for episode types. One more thing I mentioned that I'm kind of prioritizing a bit more with client shows is structure of episodes, specifically having the same structure for every episode. The best example of this is a podcast called Metrics and Chill, where each episode somebody comes on and just talks about one metric. For example, like they're just going to talk about ACV or they're just going to talk about CPC. The questions are largely the same, and this like is very clear to the audience what they're going to get. It allows the company to build a database that they can produce other content from in the future. And there's one other benefit. Oh yeah, less prep time for you as the host. And so that's another way you can differentiate with the show, is that you would pick one kind of data point and then just dig into that with every episode.
Good. Yeah, that helps. Yep. I cut you off. Step 1, niching. Step 2, great structure, a consistent structure, and everyone knows what the structure is potentially. And then what would be, is there anything else you would want to make sure?
So I think the third one is like taking a different angle on the topic, like with your example of having B2B buyers instead of B2B performance marketing experts. I think that's a good angle. The fourth one is a bit more advanced, which is to like step away completely from the like guest interview strategy and build like narrative-based shows, which are like probably 5 times the amount of work. You still can build relationships because you can bring in characters into that story, but like the production like costs and time is like significantly greater. So I probably wouldn't recommend that for someone starting a show.
Could you give some more examples on that? What's like a narrative based? For example, this what we're doing right now, it's not really a podcast, although it could be. But then this is more of an interview style thing, right? That we're doing. So how would you maybe edit this to be more of narrative style?
So yeah, you wouldn't be able to edit what we're doing now into a narrative style. Like if you've ever heard like Serial, which is like a true crime podcast, this was like the first one that got really big, but you basically tell a story over a number of episodes. The best B2B example is Breaking Brand, a podcast by Buffer, where they follow like a D2C agency as they like grow over like 6 episodes, and it's like an amazing show, but like is a lot more work to produce.
Got it. Yeah, that's interesting, right? So I've seen one of these that I was hooked to, right? There was this one person or there were 2 CMOs who were basically discussing that, hey, I've just become the CM of this brand, and over the next 10 or 12 episodes, I'm going to share my experience of exactly what we're doing, why we're doing that in this one company. And that's what hooked me. So yeah, I guess that was interesting, but I don't think it was a lot more effort. Or did I misunderstand completely?
Yeah, so I think you can, if you're just like in that example, like that wouldn't be as much effort. But what I'm talking about is like the highly produced, like journalistic style shows where there's like a narrator and they bring in different characters.
Got it. Yeah. Right. So if let's say, we can talk about a couple of things, right? And I think you will be the better person. You've spoken to more people than me to understand, what would be more helpful. So one question that I've always seen people ask, right? Okay, how important is audio? How important is video? How important is which software to use? So maybe just very much on the logistical side, maybe we can go there. Whatever are the most common questions you've seen people ask around podcasting, or how does what kind of a team would you need to pull it off? So maybe more on the logistic side of doing this.
Sure. So I think that let's just run through your points. So video and audio, we recommend recording both. We typically prioritize audio, but then also record video and try and get that as good as we can. It just helps with content syndication because you can put the full length long form video on YouTube. We can cut up little clips, and live snippets work better than audio form snippets. So we recommend doing all of that. In terms of tech, you can get started with Zoom, just interviewing people on Zoom, but you're not going to get as good quality as like Riverside. But then you can also record locally with Audacity, which is free for the host audio to make that a bit better. In terms of like microphone, the Blue Yeti is like the best starter mic, in my opinion, like $100. But then you can move on to something a bit more advanced after that. In terms of podcast hosting, I'm also going to say BCast.fm, which is our podcast hosting for businesses, but there are loads of options if you just Google podcast hosting. Then we use a combination of Slack, Trello, Google Drive to manage the whole process, tied together by Zapier to like automate stuff. And aside from that, yeah, Figma for managing design assets. And then what was your final question about logistics?
What kind of a team goes into creating a podcast?
Yeah, so to create one show, obviously you need a host. Now, we recommend the host is someone from the client side, maybe someone in sales, maybe the CEO. And the host, typically their time is very valuable. So you want to maximize the amount of things that they don't have to do. And so then I would probably have like a podcast manager. They're responsible for like the growth of the show, the organization. So the podcast manager is going to be managing all the other resources and just saving time for the host. So the other resources that you'll need is like a writer and a researcher, an audio/video editor, a designer, and that's probably it. So the writer and researcher is going to research the guests and propose questions. The writer is also then going to write up the episode into key takeaways in written format and also create social posts for the episode. The audio and video editor is going to edit the audio, the long form video, and also video snippets to put on social. And then the designer is going to create various visual assets for the episode as well. And so then the podcast manager is going to be managing those resources in order to ensure everything happens on time, and then also communicating with the host and communicating with the guest. So like if you're just starting out, I'd recommend having the host as your CEO or someone from sales or marketing, and then you'd have a podcast manager, typically like a marketing manager, and then you can start off with the other three people, the writer / researcher, audio video editor, and graphic designer as freelancers. And then if you have other requirements in the business, or if you want to scale the show, you bring them on full time.
I have a question about distribution, but then okay, what parts of this do you think is best to outsource, right? Because because building the team out that you've just mentioned, one option is that if you have a lot of people, you could take a lot of the bandwidth that they currently are putting somewhere else and try to put it here. But I don't think most companies that even we work with have all the people that would be required, or even if they have the people, they would have to learn a lot of things. So maybe a scale that, hey, if you want to just optimize, if you just want to outsource some key small bits, but you would have to keep a lot of it to yourself, this is the minimum amount of outsourcing that you can do, this is the maximum amount of outsourcing that you can do.
So I think the max outsourcing that I would recommend is having the podcast manager in-house, someone in the marketing team, or even someone in like admin or ops could probably do it. But no, actually it'd be good for them to know about marketing because they're going to be responsible for the metrics. And then everything else would be outsourced. So they're just managing the freelancers essentially and communicating with the host and guests. That's like minimum. That's maximum outsourcing. Minimum outsourcing would be to employ the graphic designer. Maybe the podcast manager can do the writing and researching, and then you'd also have to hire a audio video editor. But I probably wouldn't recommend that starting out. I'd recommend having the host, podcast manager in-house, and then the rest freelancers.
Got it. So what about just distribution, right? So one, obviously we can create video out of it, we can create audio out of it, and because it is in video format, it can be created into a lot of things. And I think most people who are listening or will listen to it can at least list down 10 or 15 things that this can be repurposed into, right? So what I'm asking is more of a prioritized things, that if you had to pick the top 3 or 5 places to actually publish it, or if we had to redistribute it and we only had, let's say, 3 hours to distribute it, how would you do it?
I mean, I think it depends on the podcast and the ideal listeners, right? Because different people are going to be at different platforms. I think for the majority of B2B shows, the answer to that question is probably LinkedIn at the moment, but then that may change in the future. And so instead of like, let's say you had like 10 energy points to spend on distribution, instead of spending like 2 on the top 5 places where you'll find people, I'd probably start out by spending all your energy points just on LinkedIn, because it is competitive and you're only going to break through and get engagement and attention if you're better or adding more value than other people. So I'd put all of your effort into that one place, which is probably going to be LinkedIn. And then it's like when you see that working, you scale it, try to maximize the value from that. And then only then would I go to try and master other channels.
Got it.
And so like practically how you go about doing this is working out how you can get the most attention organically from your host posting video, image, or written content, and typically a combination of those performs the best. And so just optimizing that process. So getting your writer or getting the marketing manager to improve the copy they're producing, getting your video editor to improve the videos they're editing. And then ideally, you're actually only going to win if your host is improving the way they ask questions, and if you're getting better guests on your show, because that's ultimately what's going to produce the good content for that syndication. So I would give that responsibility to the marketing manager. They're going to start by training their host. Maybe you need to get a freelance like voiceover actor or someone to help train the host, and that the marketing manager is also going to be responsible for getting better guests, because if you get better guests, you're going to have better content to get more attention on social. So I would just spend the marketing managers responsible for doing all of that until like that first channel is producing growth before moving on to the next one.
Got it. I know we only have a minute left. I will ask a shorter question. What do you feel about, or how do you feel about just taking on sponsors? because I have seen a lot of, even the agency example that I gave, they had a sponsor very early on. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you just have to understand pros and cons, right? Like having a sponsor is going to hinder growth a little bit because you're putting in audio that the audience may or may not like. You can minimize that by ensuring the sponsor is as relevant as possible, and maybe also getting a special deal. So then you're going to like minimize the like break that's being put on growth by putting that audio in there. The upside is that you're going to have revenue to invest in better content or in promotion. So I'm definitely not against it. If the sponsor is aligned with the audience.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think that's everything that we had time for. I still have a ton of questions, so maybe I'll just DM you or something. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Uh, how do people reach out to you if they have questions? Maybe just introduce your agency once and just tell people how to find your agency, or even maybe about BCast.
Sure, yeah. So BCast.fm, podcast hosting for businesses, fame.so, which is a B2B podcast agency. But if you have any questions, you can just come to me on LinkedIn, Tom Hunt, or Twitter, Tom Hunt as well.
Got it. Cool. We'll put links to all of those in wherever anyone's watching this video. If it's on YouTube, it's on YouTube. If it's a podcast, if you decide to actually go that route, it's going to be on the podcast. Thank you so much for listening in, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom.